One of the things that we don't get taught often as artists is the concept of intent. Now, often when we think of artistic intent, we think of capital A art, of modern art, of artist statements where you can sticky tape a banana to a wall, write an essay about it, and then make millions of dollars. And this seems ridiculous to those of us who want to draw cool stuff from our imagination, make comics, concept art, work in video games, and basically create the type of art that we actually wanted, which is often more representational, less conceptual. But what if I told you that the concept of intent, of really thinking about the why behind your art, is actually a major aspect of what will make your art land? That this is often the hidden thing that separates the artists who really get out there and find a lot of traction and build a large audience, and those who often just kind of end up being a cog in a machine, doomed to forever fulfill and create other people's ideas. Welcome to the Visual Scholar Podcast. My name is Tim Mcburnie. I have been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this show, we're all about demystifying the worlds of art, creativity, and productivity so that you can get better faster and enjoy your artistic journey. Check out my free brainstorming toolkit. If you want to take your art to the next level and really improve your skills, one of the best ways is to create your own personal artistic project. And to do that, you need a great idea. An idea that you're passionate about, that is unique and original to you, that is going to allow you to see this project through. I've taken the same tools and frameworks that I use every day and created a workshop on world building, ideation, and brainstorming. In it, you'll learn things like how to quiet the editing mind, how to enhance your blue sky brainstorming ability, and how to use brainstorming anchors for things like story or even your pre-existing ideas and proclivities as an artist. This is a free training. I think you're really going to enjoy it. So if that is something you're interested in, go check it out. The link will be in the description. So what are we really talking about here? What am I talking about when it comes to intent? This is, on the one hand, really simple. It's just often the meaning, the deeper stuff beneath our work that really supports us. It's often the feelings that we are trying to communicate through our art. When you look at great animations, great stories, great novels, great comics, great video games, often the things that do feel a little bit more like art, like you are experiencing a singular vision, I think are things that have a lot of intent behind them, that someone was really trying to communicate something larger. And while this stuff is often connected to, as I said, capital A art, I think it is nevertheless, if you come from a commercial art background, something that we can't overlook. It's something that for me personally was kind of, people tried to train it out of me basically. So if I go back to wanting to be an artist, I think often, and let me know in the comments down below whether this is for you, or send me an email, tim@mightyartisan.com. Let me know how this lands for you. But for me, I kind of grew up wanting to make the kind of things that I saw. And this is often a little bit delusional because we often see a video game and we think, hey, I want to do that. I want to make the whole thing. I want to write a whole book. I want to make this whole comic. We often see things that we want to create because they're the things that inspired us. And I feel like a lot of artists and people who have these creative tendencies, we do want to make things with meaning by default, because often we're receiving really good meaning and we're immersed in these worlds that we consume, and we want to do the same thing. That's what it was like for me anyway. Let me know what your experience has been. I think this concept, though, is often people try and beat it out of us, right? So for me, I came out of the factory, I think, wanting to do that, wanting to be an auteur, wanting to make my version of the things that I saw around me. And what I noticed around me as I grew up and started to talk to other artists and people who are professional and to look for mentors was that a lot of people had kind of given up on that attitude, and they really viewed that concept of being an auteur, an author, having a voice as like, oh, that's just, that's kind of cute. That's funny that you still believe that's possible. But in the real world, if you want to earn a decent income, you kind of need to serve the interests of others. You need to be more of like a hand that draws other people's ideas. And you often need to just figure out what the market wants, right? We need to make sure that we are doing what is commercially viable. And I saw a lot of illustrators and people in artistic fields who were doing really well. Like the amount of money they were making, to me, was beyond aspirational. Like I didn't know anyone else who was making that amount of money in my life. Like they were making more than my parents, my family was making. And this seemed really good. But they all seemed very disconnected from the idea of being an artist. And I think this is one of these interesting things when it comes to education, is that this concept of intent is often a little bit separated. And kind of if you go to art school, you get one vibe. If you go to entertainment design school, you get one vibe. If you go to graphic design school, you get a different sort of read on the concept of how important your ideas are. And it took me a long time to really navigate my way through this idea of like, how much should I be really focusing on what I have to say and what my artistic intent is? On the one hand, everything that I saw when it came to working commercially and what I found to work really well was that commercially, we subjugate and sublimate our ideas to the clients. And the client is always right. And I think that's a really powerful idea that will serve you well in business. But I was fortunate to sort of fall into the French comic book industry and more specifically to work with editors or writers who really did believe in the artist's way, that the idea here was to actually say something important, not to just serve the market and give people kind of what they wanted and make these kind of blockbuster Hollywood style creations, but that success really was a matter of saying something unique and interesting and being a true artist, and that there was a massive amount of respect and social value placed upon that. And I feel like that really sort of drew me back a little bit more towards the idea of thinking about how important artistic intent is and how important it is for us not to get lost in the sea of entertainment design and just basically doing other people's ideas. I think this is a really, really important topic for us as, again, if you're listening to this, you're probably more in that frame where you didn't go to capital A art school and draw triangles and tape things to walls and write essays about it. Maybe you're more interested in drawing things that are representational, working in the entertainment industry, the various fields. I think that often we get served really poorly when it comes to this idea. And if you do claw your way out of this idea of creating other people's ideas and trying to move towards you making your own world, your own concepts, and really figuring out how to do that properly, to look at, okay, here are the things that really inspired me and like, why are they so good? Like, why is a Miyazaki Ghibli film why does it have such a strong sense of authorship? Like, how do you build that? How do you move towards that? Like, what does that take? There's not a lot of training there. It's just sort of viewed as a mysterious happenstance. But we are trained specifically to serve other people's ideas, which is also challenging. So anyway, I think this is a really interesting idea. I'm going to try and unpack some of these concepts in this episode of the Visual Scholar podcast and see whether we can understand how some of this happens and how I think we can move towards understanding our own intent better, and why I think that is so important and why I think it's going to be more important now that we have just a sea of AI sludge that is competing for everyone's attention. Firstly, I think it would be good to maybe look at why some of this stuff is happening. Like, why are there so many artists, I think anyway, who start out really wanting to be more of an author, of like making your own stuff and just creating work that is coming out of your mind and your imagination. Why does this tend to get viewed as a second-class citizen, or that's just not very practical? Why do we end up here? I think one of the first obvious reasons is that there's a big divide between fine art and commercial art. And this has its roots in history that is probably a whole podcast episode unto itself, of where a lot of that technical craft peaked in the 19th century, in the late 1800s, in the late Renaissance, where artists really mastered. And you had your masters like Sir Lawrence Alma Tadema or your Bouguereau, and these artists who just were able to make something that's like better than a photo. These things still look better than photos. They still look, if you go and see these original paintings of mythological scenes recreated, religious scenes recreated, scenes from antiquity, from history, recreated by these amazing artists on giant canvases. This was amazing, like as a technological feat, being able to turn those things that were just ideas and concepts and make them real for the first time on a giant canvas in oil. Amazing technical ability. And I feel like, I don't know why, but modern art really took hold. And I think it created a big divide between this, because I think a lot of artists needed to diminish that technical ability, because the technical ability got so good that it was probably quite challenging to compete in that arena. And I think people found a way to use marketing and a lot of good sales tactics to promote the concept of more conceptual art, where it was about Duchamp's toilet bowl. It was about cubism, conceptual ideas, right? Where it is more about your intent and people need to interpret the art. And I think this is a really fun idea. I don't have anything against it, but it's this divide between that, where often modern art needed to really diminish the quality and the importance of technical craft in order to justify its superiority. And this idea is just filtered down to infinity, to the point where like you can be 100, 150 years later sitting there saying like, I want to be an artist, and you still got to deal with this divide, even though it has no relation to what we're actually doing today. But you're often faced with learning art, which is often capital A art, where you do deal with more conceptual ideas. You go and learn how to draw triangles and arrange them in a nice, interesting idea, and you talk about why your triangles feel a particular way. It's often about emotion and artistic intent and the conceptual idea behind what you're doing. And I think that there's a lot of value here. And again, this could probably be a whole episode where we could go deeper into this and talk about all the problems there and the difficulty that those institutions actually have with creating people who actually have genuine new ideas and actual conceptual intent. But there is this divide that I think means that often if you're a commercial artist, you kind of view that stuff as not what you do. And that often the pathway to success as an illustrator or someone who is more representational or who doesn't want to deal with that fine art field is that you have to really work with clients and industry and commercial companies. And you really have to be someone who sublimates your own ideas and you become more of an illustrator. You're like a hand that creates other people's work, basically. And I think this is just a very different idea of what being an artist is, right? Of what creating pictures is. So often the problem is that as artists who are in a commercial field, if you don't go to capital A art school, we kind of told to not pay much attention to all that conceptual stuff. And again, a lot of us will view a banana taped to a wall with an essay and say, that is ridiculous, that is nonsense. But I think the reality is like maybe we need to reintegrate a lot of those ideas and avoid this divide, which really doesn't serve us at all, because it does separate us from those concepts of intent and the higher meaning behind our work, because we're just trained to be a cog in a machine. The real thing here is that we often fall into an execution trap as commercial artists, where we get trained to, and I think this is the thing that really works for you, that will make your career better and make you more money as a commercial artist if you get really good at serving other people's vision. As a concept artist, like, yes, I need a point of view. Like, yes, I need to do my stuff. And yes, I need to be able to provide a particular style and be selected. And there's certainly a huge degree to where people working in commercial fields are being employed for their point of view. But still, I think what I notice the most is that when those people go and make their own work, they often, firstly, they don't, because it's so intimidating to make their own thing. And secondly, because they don't have that creative tension that they built up their entire lives, and that part of the process of working with someone else, that we often miss this ability to really think about, what am I doing here? What's the point? Why am I saying this? Because part of being a commercial artist and being at peace with it is focusing far less on that intent and being comfortable when someone else changes the meaning, when some director or some game director or an editor just says, actually, we've decided we're going in a different direction. You kind of have to steel yourself and just be like, that's okay, because this is not my thing. I'm just part of the process. And I think to a certain degree, you need to be successful at that in order to achieve financial success and peace of mind as a commercial artist. That there needs to be a degree to where we accept our role to be successful. That's what I found anyway. Let me know what you think of that. And I think this means that often intent feels foreign. It feels like it is not really something that we're meant to be doing, because we're not often responsible for that why. So the reality is that in order to create a great movie or book or animation or whatever it is, you do need that creative director, that singular vision. Too many cooks in the kitchen often doesn't work that well. It is often a matter of a lot of people working to serve a singular vision. And I think that we just often get used to operating without that North Star. And the idea of having our own intent, although it's something we always feel is lacking, from my experience anyway, a lot of people just get a bit lost because they don't really know what to do. So someone will be working on a great Hollywood film. They'll be quite a successful part of that endeavor. They'll be working on ideas that do have a strong intent because there are directors and people at the top who are thinking about that vision. But because you are subjugating and sublimating your own vision to that director's vision, you're kind of never really facing the same challenges. You're not building that muscle of thinking about, as I make a change, how is that change that I'm making to my character design that I'm creating for this movie, or the expression or the emotion or the way that some creature is designed or the way that the world works. Like, we're not often thinking why that's happening. Our job is just to kind of do it. We're often told why, but again, we're not building that muscle of really thinking about how that connects to what we have to say. Really obvious stuff. And what we focus on instead is like how to draw better hands, how to render better, how to be better technical artists, how to use tools to make things faster. And a lot of processes in concept art, or even as like the process you would use, for instance, if you are a comic book author, the process we use and the process we're trained in is really designed so that we can interface with a professional editor, with a professional series of other people who are going to tell us what to do. If you don't have anyone telling you what to do, the degree to which your creative process may change to better express your intent, to make yourself more unique, is quite interesting. You may not create all of this preparatory work. You may not create a storyboard in the same way that you would if you don't have to show it to anyone. So at every level, the way that we're trained to focus on craft, to build reliable processes that we can sort of involve other people in. Again, I think reliable processes are good, but often, again, we are trained to make sure that other people can tell us what to do. And with concept art, the way that we often find the process works best, that's the reason that 3D is such a major part of concept art, is it's a lot easier to make changes. And we need to make changes because we're always having people telling us to change things. Well, if you're creating something that is your artistic vision, you're not really having to make changes in the same way. You have a slightly different process. And this just goes for every strata of creative endeavor. If you're an illustrator, we're trained, and again, I think there's a lot of wisdom to this, to creating a thumbnail and working through the process in stages. But the fact that we're often trained to create 3 thumbnails and we have to have a certain amount of variance between them so that we can show that to an editor so they can let us choose. And often the point at which we're forced to stop at a particular point along that process to send it to someone. These are things that if you're just working for yourself and you're just developing your own intent, your own vision, and you're not working with anyone else, you may do it completely differently. You may do 100 thumbnails until you find the right one. You may do one and realize that that's it. That's the one I want. You may do 20 that are almost identical because you're trying to figure out your intent, your vision. When we work with other people, we're trying to serve their vision. So it's less a matter of us really kind of being a dog on a bone with that idea and being like, this is not quite right. My intent is not coming through this illustration. I will continue to fiddle with it until I get it right. It's more a matter of, whatever. I don't know. I'll just make 3 and I'll send them off, right? It's a very different process. So we often get trapped in this idea of like execution being our skill, rendering, drawing being our skill, and we develop everything about our creative process and how we make things so that we can be a cog in a machine. And I think this leads us to this last point I want to make here about sort of why is that often this means that we're kind of missing the fundamental thing, which is permission to do this. So it's not just that we are technically separated from this idea. It's that often we don't have permission for ourselves to do this. When you get told so many times that the client is always right, that we're serving a director's vision, that again, like just ship these 3 thumbnails, send them to the editor, like they'll pick them. And we tell all these stories to ourselves about like, they're always going to pick the one that we don't want. They're always going to pick the thumbnail we don't want. And it always happens. And like, oh, that's just life. There's a certain degree where you're separating yourself from the permission to both come up with that idea and commit to it and believe in it and get really excited about it. Because I think the real truth that I found after, again, creating my own fantasy series and creating a lot of sort of more original works where I do have a lot more control is that when you are creating something that does have some unique intent, where like, I really care about this idea, and it can be silly. Like I'm drawing a comic at the moment that is about space aliens, and there's like little furry creatures in it, and there's a huge variety of different things. But like the core of the story is something I really care about. And like if someone kind of came along and said, oh, well, let's change it to be like this, like I would go to war. I would be like, no, you don't understand. That's not what this story is about. If I change that, it's going to change this. And then this is not going to work. Like when you are really taking authorship and ownership of a story or an idea or a concept, the specifics do matter. And you need to really understand that like you will feel a certain degree of ownership and connection and emotional connection with that idea and the success or failure of that idea. And I think there's a degree to where if you're not willing to give yourself permission to do that, it's going to be really hard to get excited enough about it to complete it. And I think that often what happens is if you take that same attitude from a commercial approach, which is like, oh, I'm going to do 3 thumbnails and do this and see that, and I'll just go through the processes. Often because you're not connected, this is my experience anyway, often because you're not connected enough with the material, it's really hard to see it through over a year, 2 years, 3 years, the amount of time it actually takes to create something of your own. Or often people just kind of get halfway through a painting that, might only take a day or, a couple of days or maybe even 3 or 4 hours. And you kind of get halfway through and you're like, well, I'm kind of done. I don't really care. Because we're not really connected to the why. We don't really have a strong thing where like, I care that this thing gets out because it has some idea that I think is really important. So I feel like here, again, it's really easy to see why we have this divide in art education and in our experience, and why a lot of people who I think have the capability to create really strong works with a lot of intent. And often we're inspired by artists who obviously have a lot of intent and creative drive behind their ideas, and they're very distinct, and you can kind of feel that authorship with like sort of really good works. Is often we don't know how to do that. We're not trained how to do that. We're ideologically opposed to it. And we're also not even giving ourselves permission to try in the first place, because it's really annoying when you try to put yourself and your own intent into work and then that just gets crushed by this giant machine. So I guess it would next be good to look at why I think the concept of intent is so important. And after that, we'll actually look at maybe some more practical things of like how we could think about how you could think about using this a little bit more or developing this skill. But before we do that, let's look at why I think this is so good. Like why the concept of intent is such a powerful idea. And especially now where, and I think this is often what happens with this cycle of artistic development that we have, is that we often do reach really good technical levels of artistic competence. And you could see this in that post-Renaissance and the Renaissance era of representational art where people got so good. And then what happened is it cratered, and it was like, let's do cubism instead, where none of that matters. And, there's stories of people purchasing a Bouguereau painting and like, because it wouldn't fit over the fireplace, they just like cut it off, right? So it's like a great portrait or something. And like, this is how undervalued this was, is that someone's like, yeah, I bought this thing. And these are paintings which are worth like millions of dollars now, right? Like, and at the time would have been like extremely successful and popular, but this created so much that people were basically like, I'll just kind of cut the bottom off, I'll put it in a new frame, stick it above the mantelpiece. Like, it's okay. Complete disregard for the technical capability of artists. And I think as you saw commercial art spin up again after that, we have a resurgence in the technical capability of artists with illustration, because often artists were required to make that machine function. And I think this is where the representational artists got much more enmeshed with the industry and the needs of advertising, of entertainment. And, you had companies like Disney that employed a lot of artists. A lot of printing became far more possible. So, you had this golden age of illustration proliferate, and this built a huge amount of strength and power in the representational artist again. Less so for us creating our own things, but more so for us being part of a machine. And what you find after that is that photography came along, and it really took the knees out of that market, right? It really chopped the legs off that thing. And after that, you didn't really need every soap commercial, every toothpaste commercial, every fashion commercial, every advertisement, every newspaper ad everywhere to be illustrated by a human. You could just kind of take a photo of it. And as photography got better and reproduction got better, you kind of saw that a lot of the skills there that were for representational art again became not respected. And certainly illustration persisted and continued, but less so for just, I'm drawing a photo of someone using toothpaste or wearing a particular dress because everything had to be drawn, right? Even in my lifetime, I remember where every illustration in a hardware magazine, a hardware flyer, right? So advertising hardware store, like nuts, bolts, screws, drills, mowers, all that kind of stuff, right? Like all of those little illustrations were drawn by hand. And that was like one of these things that would employ a huge number of people. And then again, that just all became completely pointless. We got clip art. That became really easy. You could just put photos there. So we often have these cycles, right? And the reason I think intent is so important is because we're kind of at that point now where we have one of these other AI cycles where a lot of artists have been trained to avoid the thing that would actually make them unique in the face of artificial intelligence or generative imagery, which is the meaning behind the work, and having some point of view that these AI things just can't, and I don't think ever will be able to replicate or even come close to. But we see, again, that vicious cycle where the pure just ability to create something representational devalues a lot of what was previously a really strong industry. And I don't think this is quite as much as it's hyped up to be. I've talked about this extensively. But I think obviously the way out of this for a lot of artists is to work a little bit more on creating actual interesting things, to be far less of a cog in a machine. And I think that should be really obvious that we have had what I call a second golden age of illustration, where concept art and entertainment design has reached such heights where the degree of fantasy that needs to be created for modern VFX is so high, and the degree of design that is required for video games is so high, there's so much of it, that it's created an entire new, what will be viewed as a second golden age of illustration and representational art. And, it is the same where a lot of artists are so frustrated at the skills that people have developed to work on these big projects that there's a lot of blowback where people seem to think like, hey, and now that AI can create representational fantastical art really easily, that means all these artists who built these skills are irrelevant. And I don't think that's ever quite true, but you can see that these sort of cycles tend to repeat where we build up good representational art skills, we figure out how they're going to apply and be useful. But the real challenge is for a long time, we have been wed to the commercial aspects of our art and how it's used, obviously. So why is this so important, right? We kind of talked about that. I think this is so important because when you do have intent and when you are really thinking as an author, every decision becomes purposeful. And it's much more a matter of your color choices being specific to the emotion that you are trying to achieve, the composition, the level of finish, the subject matter, the way that we actually create the art becomes all in service of our actual intent, of our actual feelings, the emotions that you want to get across. And this is really what changes how people perceive you as an artist. So again, I've sort of doubled down on like why I think the commercial aspects of this are so important to pay attention to. But I'm going to land this plane because I think this is a really important point. And it's why I really believe there's a lot of opportunity out there that just is completely untapped because we've just been trained to be a cog in a machine and to be someone else's hand that is going to draw their stuff. If you change your attitude from that sort of commercial, I'm just doing what other people are telling me, to an author mindset, it transforms you from someone who sort of just draws well to someone who creates work with a point of view. And you become an author of that work, not just someone who's sort of executing the work and sort of doing a good job at it. And I think this changes how other people perceive you, right? It really changes the way that you are viewed as an artist and the value you can place upon your work, irregardless of technical skill. And there's a lot of lessons we can have here as creative individuals that maybe in a guerrilla warfare way we can take from the things that Picasso and co did to compete against the heavily representational art. Now, this is because probably if you look at this from the other side, if you kind of go and flip it and steel man the other side, you can kind of see that probably a lot of this hyper-representational work like did kind of maybe take itself a bit too seriously. Maybe there was a lot of people who were just kind of repeating the same representational stuff, and it was just an overwhelming competition about who has the best craft, who can make the most fantastical historical representation of that particular time Julius Caesar met someone, right? Or this thing happened, and we can all ooh and ah at the rendering and all that kind of technical stuff. And I think it would be easy to say, what's the point, right? We kind of got good at this, guys. What's the point? And I think the key is that if you look at having a strong intent and a strong point of view, it drives your growth and your focus and the actual way that you make art. So one of the big challenges we have is that often, because the way that art is reproduced and the way that we've built up the traditions of our art as illustrators and people who make art for, again, back in the day, it would have been illustrations for children's books, illustrations for all sorts of things like board games, etc. You were kind of trying to, and I'm sort of thinking about this in, the sort of post-50s, post-photography boom, you really were trying to create something with polish, something that felt professional, something that was clean, because that's the thing that was hard. That's the thing that was always been hard, is like to create polished work. So photography kind of made that representational polished work was no longer valuable. But the thing that we're always pursuing is a certain level of professionalism or goodness with our technical art, because we're often executing other people's ideas. And this means that the way that we can value ourselves is on our technical ability. The thing, though, when you become an author, is that really doesn't matter, because all you have to do is move the needle of emotion. You really just need to make people feel something. And this is exactly the same idea that you can see Picasso and his contemporaries. And again, I just use Picasso because it's the most stereotypical, iconic representation of that idea, where they said, like, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter how good you are at drawing, because I can make you feel something that you haven't felt before by just drawing this weird cubist stuff. And I think that's really important to pay attention to, because as commercial artists, we've been separated from that idea. People who invest in gallery work and capital A art have really been poorly served by the gallery system. And it's all a little bit of a sort of a scammy place to be from sort of my experience. And it kind of often means that you are like having to play a particular role. Again, there's a lot of like shadow side to the way that, despite people often viewing themselves as these maverick modern artists, they're actually trapped in a little prison of their own making, where they have to keep doing the same things. They have to keep putting the prices up on their work. And there's definitely like a weird sort of, shady side to the money aspect of gallery work. That's completely separate to like, is the work good? Like what is actually happening? So the reality is there's often not a lot of real strong intent there either. That's been sort of changed a bit. But the real thing is we can draw a lot of strength and understanding from that, where you can potentially make a lot of impact if you think more about the intent. Like, what is your story about? What is your art about? And we separate ourselves, right? We detach, we decouple from the commercial ideas of what is good art, which is often polished. You have a process so that art directors can tell you what to do. It's often sort of clean. And what you kind of find is that these days, a lot of people are actually going to be, I think, far more interested in art that feels obviously made by a human. The sad thing is that there's so much highly polished professional art out there, and people have gotten so good at it that I don't think people appreciate it anymore. I've said this before many times, but often if you post your amazing polished, this is my League of Legends splash screen wallpaper art that is just amazing. Like on every level, it's like a 10 out of 10 of like contrast, composition, anatomy, style, vibrancy, impact. People are so used to saying that they kind of almost don't know that it's made by a person. People are shocked that that's actually something that someone makes. Like they don't know how people do it. A lot of people don't understand how people can actually draw things that look realistic, or how they can draw things from different angles. Most people just imagine everything is from reference, or, like most people have no idea. So it's why often what works better is a little sketch on Instagram with a picture of your pencil next to it, because then you can actually tell that a human did it. And that's really interesting. And often what sort of works better are silly little drawings that people think are funny or interesting, or art styles that feel like they are geared towards a particular vision, where you can tell that someone has a really strong idea on the art style, and the technique and the technicality that that artist is building up supports their vision 100%. And this is just a very different attitude, I think, to what we get trained to do as commercial artists. And this changes it from us being there to sort of decorate and make everything kind of look good and look interesting. And it really forces us as artists to be more communicators, to think about what the intent is, what we're trying to say, and to build our artistic skill, our craft, our process, and everything around supporting that. And I think a lot of people see this transition as being a major challenge these days, because you're trained to create work in a different way. You're trained to have a different artistic creative identity, not as an author, but rather as an illustrator, as someone who makes other people's ideas come true. And it's just a massive shift to kind of change everything to this new way of thinking. And I guess that's why there's a couple of things that are really important. Firstly, this is why intent is really critical. And it's critical these days as an artist to get closer to this, because this is what obviously makes the pithy, repetitive, overly polished nature of sort of most AI art, and the fact that it often doesn't have a strong point of view. It's often just there again to serve whoever is typing stuff in. And it kind of makes that sort of irrelevant because it doesn't have a strong point of view. It's hard to repeat it. I think there's like a natural competitive edge that humans have there, in the same way that modern art had a natural competitive edge to the overly technical art that probably was lacking a little bit of creativity and soul and fun. So this is just something to kind of think of, but it's also, and the last thing I'll kind of say here when it comes to why I think intent is so important is I think a lot of people are sleeping on and giving up on art now because they're earlier on in their journey, and they see two things. They see it's really hard to compete with all these artists who have mastered technical skill and have gotten to be creating these splash screen pieces of illustration that are just maximizing everything, and they're so good at rendering, and people have spent 10, 20, 30 years mastering their skills, and they're so good. It's like, how do you compete with that? You're just starting out. And then they see, here's a whole bunch of AI art that basically does exactly the same thing instantly. And then you have a market's contracting because of all this kind of stuff is happening in the world, like the macro sort of economy is complete trash at the moment. So I think a lot of people are kind of saying there's no real clear pathway there. And what I would say is, like, if you're starting now, it may seem like this is a really big mountain to climb, but you're actually starting with a major advantage. And that is you haven't been trained for 20 or 30 years to subjugate your ideas to someone else's. You haven't built a process to serve other people. You haven't trained yourself to deal with the pain of not being able to come up with your idea perfectly, but to create 3 versions of the idea and know that your client is going to pick the one you don't like. And to deal with the psychology. Like, this is decades of personal work, of creative perfection to get to the point where you can do that. If you learn to make art without that, you may find that you're in a really, really good position to create art that actually connects with other humans. So it's just something to think of. Let me know in the comments down below whether that lands, whether I'm just kind of dreaming or, again, I'm sort of feeling I'm falling prey to some incredible sort of privilege I have as a professional sort of artist, and I don't get it. Super keen to know what you kind of think. But I think intent is really, really important. And if you haven't learned to create art in this highly commercialized way, you may find that's actually a secret weapon right now. All right. So lastly, let's look at, I guess, how we may actually start to do this. Now, I often talk about the concept of intent related to the 5 elements of drawing, and how often at a really granular level, setting your intent and your expectations about what you're trying to achieve with your art is a major aspect of success. And often we fail as artists in the beginning because we don't have a clear set of expectations. And I think often the draw of commercialism here is that it defines those expectations. And when you're dealing with your own intent and your own expectations, because you have to set them, it's like you can move the goalpost. It creates this whole other challenge that you kind of need to master, which you can. Just in the same way you can steel yourself to the misery of creating 3 thumbnails for your whole life and having someone pick the wrong one, you can figure out how to navigate setting your own definition of what success for an illustration is and figuring out whether you need to do 1 thumbnail or 1,000 to figure it out. That's up to you. And that's the creative process. And those are the challenges we deal with when we set an emotional intent off in the beginning, like a feeling that this wants to achieve. So I often talk about intent related to drawing because I think this is a concept that you can train and a muscle you can build from the very beginning. And a lot of it is setting your expectations of, like, what are you expecting to happen? So if you look at this from just the most granular level, because again, I think this will help us understand how you can get better at these things. Often artists don't know what they should draw. We often don't think about what we would like to create. We often don't develop the muscles and the skills, and we're not taught, we're not trained to be like, what should I draw? We often go to art school, entertainment design school. Again, I taught for 10 years at a university level entertainment design school. Half the time I was doing like 4 classes a week. It was really fun. It was kind of like a little hobby that I did. So I have a lot of experience of like seeing the difference that people have when it's like, okay, come up with your own idea versus like, here's a brief where we're pretending we're in a commercial environment. And a lot of people are really relieved when you give them a brief or you say, hey, draw this. So people are often asking for a drawing prompt or like, hey, I want to do a challenge. So, and people often will work really well when there is a challenge. The thing though, I think, is if you really want to figure out yourself as an artist, you need to figure out like, how do you come up with ideas and how do you manage that process? So a lot of that comes down to just at every level, setting your expectation and your intentions when you go to sketch. So you can set your expectations any way you want. And this is the beauty of it. This is the terrifying thing. You can sit down and say, I'm going to sketch for half an hour. And if I sketch for half an hour, I have succeeded. You pat yourself on the back, you give yourself a gold star, give yourself a trophy, and you go home. You're a winner. You drew for half an hour. And I think that's often what we need to do in the beginning is like not have these fancy expectations for ourselves. Just have good intent for like, I'm training, I'm working. But often people get really confused because we're just not trained to do this stuff. And we're not sure whether we're doing studies, whether we're creating a portfolio piece, whether we're creating a personal piece, whether we are creating just a random bunch of sketches, whether we should have a plan, whether this is going to be a detailed illustration, a not detailed illustration. Are we working on our color theory as we're doing studies here? Like, what are we actually doing right now? And I think the first thing to get in the habit of is just whenever you sit down, understand what you're doing and really think through that process. Part of succeeding and making your own works is a matter of just not grinding away, but just putting one foot in front of another and getting used to that idea early on of saying like, hey, I just created a whole bunch of sketch pages. I'm just practicing. I did a half an hour practicing, an hour practicing. I filled up a whole sketchbook this month. I feel good. I set the intent for what I'm doing. Doing this at every level helps you build that muscle of being an author, of being in control of your creative process, of being able to see the intent and the result and your emotional relationship to this. And I think just this builds that muscle, which is part physical and part mental. So I think that's the first thing we can do is just get used to it every degree. And this is often what I talk about when I talk about the 5 elements of drawing, where it's like you need to know what you're drawing, you need to know how to draw, you need to know the tools or what to draw with. And then you also need to make sure you practice that. And you also need to make sure you have your intent set. Like, what are you doing? Are you rendering a finished illustration? Are you doing 10 minutes of sketching? Are you just exploring, figuring out how to do abstract mark making? Like, what are you doing? Setting the intent often means that you enjoy the process. But if we look at this as planning those kind of larger projects or things that you're going to do, I think this is much more where you do think mostly about what is the emotion that I'm trying to achieve. One of the things I really like doing, because one of my North Stars when it comes to a lot of these things is Hayao Miyazaki and the films that he has created, right? Like through Studio Ghibli. Because I think they often have a really strong point of view. I think they often do have interesting creative intent, and you can see that also manifested in the way that those pictures are put together. So if you read a lot of the things that are written and the notes that are kind of taken about those things, you can see that when you do make a film or a game or something big, you often really have to have like that clear picture of like, what do you want this? Like when someone watches this, what's the feeling that you want them to have? And you need to keep that in mind at all times. And that's what will tell you whether this scene needs to be cut because it's not really related to the whole story, or whether it's actually integral to the meaning of the story. So there's so many little scenes in like a Miyazaki film where if you followed normal kind of Western commercial sort of Disney Pixar style, does this move the story forward? Like does this, if not, cut it, right? Because you got to kill your darlings. You would probably cut a whole bunch of stuff that seems superfluous, but I think is actually at the core of you understanding the emotional aspects and the feelings of those movies. And I think, again, if you're the kind of person who appreciates that type of intent and is probably the target market for those movies, then again, it's those things that separate that person and really make that voice feel unique and strong. So I think it's just a matter of getting used to genuinely thinking about, like, what is the point of this? Like, what do I want people to feel? And then to lean into that and think about, how could I make that stronger? How could I amplify that message? How could I make that more, better, stronger, faster? As opposed to just doing other people's ideas, to really think about always your idea. And what this will mean is that as an artist, you evolve and you clarify your artistic skill set, your technical skill set, the processes you use, and everything to serve that initial vision. And I think this is where you'll find interesting creative things happen, because when we're not focusing on render the best stuff or tick all the boxes, interesting things happen, right? You make weird decisions that may not have been obvious, but they serve that vision and that idea of like what you want people to feel. And I think it's so important to have that as a vision. The real frontier, I think, is that meaning. And I think often it's a really untrained, atrophied muscle with a lot of these projects. So anyway, those are a couple of thoughts for how we can sort of build some of these capabilities ourselves. Let me know if you've got any questions or tips or ideas in the comments, or send me an email. As I said, tim@mightyartisan.com. And firstly, just with everything you do, always make sure you're considering the intent. What's my expectation here? What am I trying to achieve with my drawing, illustration, whatever? And then if you are thinking about making a larger project, this could be just a bigger illustration that's going to take you more than a couple of hours. Could be your own short film, whether that's a 3-second short film or a 1-minute short film or a 10-minute short film, whatever it is. Think about those feelings and that intent, and try and train your entire system and your process and everything to amplify that, as opposed to all this other stuff that we often get sort of told and trained to worry about. All right, let's do a couple of quick takeaways before we bounce out of here. Firstly, if we look at this from an analytical point of view, how do we analyze this? Look at it a little bit more dispassionately. I think this is really about the way that intent transforms our random technical abilities and technical actions into something that is more purposeful, that is more about communication. So improving your craft is good, but I feel like often as artists, we get trained to value ourselves based on what, where on a 1 to 10 scale, like where are we on the scale of artistic mastery, or what are we actually trying to achieve? And that's not always the case, but I feel like there is often that feeling. And especially when you're starting out and thinking, how do I navigate my way through this? It's often about building your foundation and getting better. And the reality is that the better your technical foundation and your ability, the more freedom you're going to have to express yourself, the more options you're going to have. I feel like the better our work is going to be. But the reality is that you really need to direct that towards something important. And when I think we do focus on intent, and this is something, again, I still work on. I've still been trained as a commercial artist. This is something I'm evolving with as well. But when we do focus more on intent, and when you have the option to do that, it kind of changes all those little decisions you make. And it actually makes a lot of those creative decisions very easy. Because when you do know what the point of something is, when you know the point of your graphic novel, your book, your story, your 10-second animation, your 10-minute animation, like whatever it is you're doing, whatever the scope of it is, your masterwork, when you really know what it's about, it becomes very easy to say, well, I'm just going to cut that because that doesn't have anything to do with the whole point of this. But this other little thing that seems superfluous, this is actually really important because it's going to enhance the emotional resonance, the feeling of what I'm trying to achieve. And it also means that sometimes we're going to choose artistic styles, choices that are geared towards getting the effect we want. And I think this often just sorts out the choices that we need to make and clarifies everything. Without this ability to really think about your intent, think about what you're doing and be clear about it, and navigate your way through all the creative choices based on that North Star, I would say creating these larger works is almost impossible. And I think it's just one of these major muscles you need to build if you do actually want to create work that is yours, that has any kind of meaning and resonance. At least that's what I found. If you want a simple way of looking at this, just ask yourself, before you engage in any creative endeavor, where it may be a 5-second sketch or the next 10 years of your life on some giant magnum opus project. What is the point here? What am I trying to achieve? What am I trying to communicate? If you want some practical takeaways here, like what is the practical takeaway? I've kind of covered this a little bit. The real key here is just to get used to doing this as much as possible with everything you do. And to understand that the ways that we are trained as professional artists are useful. They will allow us to have successful careers as commercial artists. I think they're worthwhile skills, but just understand that that is not the only way to create things, and that there's a lot of power to be had with you coming up with unique ways of creating that actually work for you. And I think you're going to find this a little bit more when you get used to setting your expectations and setting what you're trying to achieve. Like set the feeling that you want to create with an illustration versus like maybe the technical process. And be clear with yourself when you are practicing technical process and saying like, you know what, I'm going to make an illustration with a whole bunch of trees in it because I want to practice drawing trees as much as I can and I'm going to get really good at rendering. Okay, the intent, the point of this illustration then becomes to draw really good trees, to demonstrate great craft. It's not always about having the most emotive trees or the feeling of trees. It's a matter of you getting better at rendering trees and understanding tree anatomy, right? Set the intent and really, I think, make a clear distinction between times where you are focusing on creating work that is meant to make people feel something versus when you're studying, versus when you're just playing around, versus when you're exploring. And understand the differences there, because I think this can make a huge difference. And obviously, if you are taking on a larger project, just understand this should be a big part of it. Like, what is the point? Can you explain to someone? Can you give an elevator pitch? Like, what is my story about? What is my project about? What is my illustration about? This is not sticking a frickin' banana on a wall and writing an essay about it. This is just a fundamental part of creation that we should be able to articulate and explain it. And it can feel very challenging because we often operate in a subverbal manner. But I think if you can at least explain it to yourself, it'll help a lot. It doesn't have to be, though, what you would expect other people to say. This really is a matter of you describing it in a way for you. So like, maybe we don't have to do the best slick elevator pitch, but you should be able to say, hey, like after reading this book or looking at my art book or looking at this illustration, like this is the feeling I want you to have. This is the end game. This is the point of it all. I think once you do that, it opens up a lot of creative potential. And I think you're going to combine the best aspects of the old masters, of the people who have mastered technical proficiency, and the mastery of your Duchamp and your Picasso, where they made a toilet bowl and a whole bunch of messy drawings, into art that had more meaning than something that's fully representational. All right. Lastly, if we think about this from a spiritual or philosophical point of view, now I almost don't know where to start here. I think there's so much that could be said about this. I think it speaks so much to the way that artists are trained, but a lot of it, I think, comes down to our expectation when we're trained about like what we're actually going to be doing. And I think it's really important to pay attention to the fact that there is just this, I think, a false dichotomy and a false divide between technical proficiency and like conceptual art, or someone who is just technically good and someone who is creative, between writing and drawing. And this is because we have just grown up for a long time in the soup of industrialized creation of things. And it's important to realize that I think taking on scope of responsibility is not a problem. I think it is framed very much as a problem whereby, oh, now I've got to do this as well as this. Whereas I just grew up knowing or thinking that I just had to do this little bit of the job. And now I've got to do this, all this other stuff. Like the way that this often comes up is whenever I make a video about how I think there's a lot of good opportunities in a post-AI generative imagery world for people to start their own things, people are like, there's a huge pushback towards this because people are saying, you can't expect everyone to just be entrepreneurial or start their own business. But the reality is that whole idea is just predicated on a particular way that you're trained to think about your role in the world. Prior to a lot of industrialized society, everyone had to be entrepreneurial. You kind of, everyone had to run their own business. Like everyone had to deal with their own stuff. When we've had there's just basically this various kaleidoscope of different opportunities as, every 20 or 30 or 50 years, just everything gets turned on its head. And the roles for what your job is as an artist and how much of that intent you take on change. So I think this is just important to understand, is that we create these divisions and these divides, and we separate and dice up and change responsibilities, where it's like, oh, I'm really interested in technical capability, right? I'm in the late Renaissance era creating highly representational art of amazing mythological things, and this is really amazing. And then someone else creates this false divide between that and conceptual art because that helps their marketing campaign. And then we have industrialized creation of printing materials and publication and artistry, where you needed to have back, pre-photography, in the golden age of illustration, you would have someone who was a writer, a creative director. You would have someone who was a designer, someone who was a paste-up artist, someone who was an illustrator. Often you would actually have someone who's like a technical illustrator. There would be people who would create the technical aspects of the art. Like often the coloring of the art was done by someone completely separately. And you needed that because there was just so much work to be done. And those were highly specialized roles. You've seen that with comic book production, right? Where someone would write it, someone would often storyboard it, someone would draw it, and they're all different people. Someone would ink it, someone would color it. And then the person who was actually coloring it would be different to the person who's doing the color separation. That is to say, someone would decide what color goes where, and another technical artist would actually cut up the color plates and the separation and figure out what color actually went there on a technical level. And you just kind of needed this for production because, you had a particular publishing schedule and that sort of needed to happen. So you can see that throughout history, we've often been given these opportunities as artists where it's like there's a lot of money or fame or talent or opportunity for you as a penciler or as an inker or as a colorist or whatever. Like, this is where you kind of fit in the grand scheme of things. But before that, you had people like your Alex Raymond, your Hal Foster, people who kind of did it all. You have different ways that people have been writing, drawing, creating, doing everything themselves. The role of doing copywriting, design, finished art, production is often just one designer now. Right. And those designers are sitting there worrying whether they're going to be automated via AI or templates. And it's always really challenging to know, like, what is an acceptable amount of responsibility to take on. But like, I really think that these are just barriers in our mind that we're trained with. Having to be an entrepreneur or think about business or not think about business. If you're trained your whole life to never think about being entrepreneurial or come up with your own ideas for business, or these things are not taught to you, it seems really hard. But there are so many things that we've learned to do that people would have viewed as being extremely challenging, like using a computer, like learning to read and write, going to school. These are all things that 200 years ago would have been completely alien to most people. The fact that we're driving cars, reading and writing, going to school, everything is a matter of context. And so what I would say, if you're thinking about the challenges of taking on more responsibility and thinking more about the intent of your work, or like how to be an author, and like, oh, that sounds like a lot of work. All I can say is it's just not. It's just stuff that you do. It's just a muscle you build. And it's just that we're not trained to do that. And all of the educational structure and the industrial society we live in is geared towards us just being different. You're just trained to be more of a cog in a machine. Like, that's just how you're geared. That's what you're told. That's how we behave. But there are so many other examples from history and people who are actually doing different things to kind of show you that these are all just skills and habits you build. A lot of it is the mental scaffolding you need to just understand that you can take on that responsibility. And here's what I'll sort of leave you with is that not just that, but I think what you will actually find is that creating a production level creation, right? So I'll use the example of comic books as I know that pretty well. So for instance, if you are in someone writes it, someone storyboards it, someone else pencils it, someone else inks it, someone else colors it, someone else does the technical color separation. If you're in that world, that's actually super inefficient. Now, it's very efficient in terms of maybe being able to produce more art, but it's very inefficient in terms of the way that you actually get something really high quality or the way that you actually inject true personality into the work. And what you'd sort of tend to find is like people will have to storyboard in a way that a penciler will understand. You have to write it in a way that someone can storyboard easily. Everything becomes geared towards the production line. The way that you draw it is very much related to who is inking it. How do I know what they're going to do? And people would have these terrible arguments where someone would ink over their work as a comic book artist and they would ruin it. And they'd say, I always hated when this person inked this thing or whatever. And the reality is when you're just doing it all, you can, in your own mind, like write it, storyboard it, draw it, color it, send it off to print, make a PDF of it, like ship it out to the world. It all becomes one thing, and it's actually pretty easy because there's not a whole bunch of cooks in the kitchen, that there's massive efficiencies involved if you do take on more things as more of an auteur or where you take control of the creative vision. And I think you can also maybe see this again. I have no domain expertise, but you can see this with the efficiency and the effectiveness of someone like Miyazaki creating a Ghibli film with that particular production style. And again, that seems to be a production style that a lot of different sort of directors use there, where it's one person coming up with the story and storyboarding the entire thing and directing it. And you get a really clear vision. And there's a huge amount of efficiencies there where someone just storyboards it, right? It's not, you don't have this like torturous Western storyboarding process where like a million people have to storyboard this film and they go back and forwards and they kind of deify hacking away at it and changing it all the time. It's just a very different attitude. There's massive efficiencies if just someone is doing it. And if that someone is you and you can take on multiple responsibilities, what you find is like, it's far less a matter of like, now I've got to do twice as much work. And it's more a matter of like, now you actually do less work. And more importantly, you can actually focus on doing the important thing, which is thinking about what the whole freaking point of it is about in the first place. Anyway, that's all I got for this particular episode. Thanks for hanging out with me. If you've been with me all this time, I really appreciate it. This was a little bit longer than the last few episodes, but I think this is a really fun topic. It's something I care a lot about, something I think about a lot more and more these days. So yeah, let me know whether this one was interesting, whether this helped you think through things. If you got any comments down below, leave them. Like, subscribe, leave comments, leave reviews, ring bells, all that kind of stuff. I don't even know. There's so many bells and subscribes and following things you can do, but they all help. I really appreciate it. But yeah, mostly I'd just be keen to know what you think. Anyway, that's all for this one. I'll see you around in the next one.